So what I'm going to try and do is go through the basic principles of non-violence, how it works in terms of the literature and the theory. I forgot your name.
Rowan.
And Rowan is who's got a lot of experience of doing direct action going back many years. We'll do some input on that as well. Then we'll split up and discuss those amongst ourselves. And then the next section is I'm going to discuss some of the major comebacks we've had as XR from the radical left or from various different groups saying what we're doing is a bad idea for various reasons, and how you might be able to respond to those, or what your mum says, if you see what I mean, stuff like that. And there's a number of, so that's like the argument around it, because there's quite a number of really coherent critiques of non-violence, and it's important to know how to respond to that as a movement, if you see what I mean. And then the third section will be the design elements. So that's basically, you go back to Bournemouth or something, and you've got your 30 people, and only 4 of them have ever done civil disobedience before, and how are you going to design doing something in Bournemouth, with these people that are really enthusiastic but a little bit scared and don't really know how it works and don't want to upset people but sort of want to upset people as well. Do you see what I mean? And or how we build up to April the 15th. And I'm hoping, I should say, before I forget, that I'm hoping that maybe some of you may be interested in the action and logistics side of this national mobilisation, in which case you could come and see me later, because as I said this morning, I don't know if you heard this, is the action and logistics national teams, and many of the national teams are very London, south of England centric, as it were, which is no bad, that's all cool, but we need, it'd be good to include people from the local groups or from a broader array of areas who do have experience or interest in helping to fill in the colours, as it were, of this escalation into April. So if you're interested in that, you can come see me later. I should say, just to not upset your egos too much, it doesn't guarantee you get in because it's a little bit of a fuzzy thing, but but I'm not quite sure how that process works, to be honest with you, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, so where's my book? So I said a little bit about this yesterday. There's a whole number of ways in which you can sort of go about describing why and how non-violence or civil disobedience works. Sometimes people use direct action, by the way, rather than civil disobedience. XRs tended to use civil disobedience because it has a more precise meaning. Direct action, it covers a multitude of sins, but it generally means doing something direct against an opponent, and it doesn't necessarily have to be non-violent, but it generally assumes it is. But that's why it's non-violent direct action. But so these definitions, people used to have big arguments about definitions, and obviously, a word is a word, you know what I mean? Different people project meanings onto it. So we usually use civil disobedience because that's more, as I understand it myself anyway, that sort of presumes non-violence. But I'll mainly be talking about non-violence because it's a bit more precise than civil disobedience in my wording in this workshop, I guess, because non-violence is the main word used in the literature. So there's basically, as I said, there's different people can do different things, and Ronan, you're going to have a slightly different way of describing it, which I think is great. So you'll get 2 sort of takes, if you see what I mean. So the super basic idea about non-violence, of course, is that non-violence is more effective than violence. So this debate is more or less settled, apart from, when I was like 15, there used to be loads of people think violence was a great idea. But I think over the last 30 years, it's more or less been settled, at least empirically, that violence isn't a great idea. And obviously, there's loads of moral arguments. But I am going to be, in my own presentation anyway, be focusing more on the design sort of empirical side of it, do you know what I mean? Rather than whether things are right or wrong. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as well, because there's confusions between the 2 arguments, as you might say. So just to sort of deal with that quickly is there's been social research on all the different rebellions and uprisings that have happened since 1900, about 300 of them, and professional social scientists who were security studies scholars, so they weren't particularly left-wing or anything, basically did a study, and the takeaway, if you don't want to read the book, I'm going to give you the 2 books to read, by the way, later. But the takeaway, if you don't want to read the book, is over the last 100 years of all these rebellions and, you know, uprisings and all the rest of it, 54%, the ones that were non-violent, 54% of them were successful, and if they were violent, 25% of them were successful. Okay? So that's, in social science, that's a big difference because it's a big N set, as they say. It's over a lot of different studies, a lot of case studies. So that's more or less like, you know, it's a bit like climate science. Basically, that's it. The deal's more or less done. You know, it's not 45, 55. It's significant. And what's even more significant is that of those 25% that were violent and won, within 5 years, those societies were like fundamentally totalitarian or authoritarian or in a chaotic, violent mess. Do you see what I mean? So only 1 in 20 of those successful violent uprisings actually resulted in something vaguely constructive. In other words, like it's a no-brainer that if you go for the violent option, you're more or less certain to produce a society that continues having a lot of physical violence in it, one way or another. So why is that? So I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but I think it's useful to know that this it's not because of sort of moral things, as it were. It's more because of the physical nature of what violence does and non-violence does. And one of the key elements of non-violence is it has a low barrier to entry. And we can discuss this quite a lot more during this workshop. So in other words, like if you're going to have a sit down in central London, in principle, you can do that whether you're 4 or 84. You can do it if you're black or white or whatever. Do you see what I mean? You don't have to bring a machine gun, you know, which is expensive. Do you see what I mean? So loads more people do it. While if you're a violent movement, obviously, you know, you need all this kit and you have to keep it secret so people don't know about it. While if it's open civil disobedience, people get to know about it. And then there's this sort of rather hilarious fundamental point is violence hurts and lots of people don't like getting hurt. So it's a bit of a lot less people will actually engage in violence for the obvious reason that getting shot is not most people's cup of tea, if you see what I mean. So that's that debate. Okay, so I'm not going to primarily focus on that because I assume we're sort of more or less sorted on it. But one of the things which was more interesting, in my opinion, from that study was why non-violence does work. And again, the big takeaway is that it works because lots of people do it. Okay, so the human brain is not very good at separating small numbers from big numbers, if you see what I mean. So you say, people went out and did X, and more people went out and did X. You think about X, you don't think about the numbers. But it turns out that it's the numbers that basically produce the result. And the reason why non-violence is successful is it enables mass participation in civil disobedience. So that's why, from a design point of view, we're not going to have loads of, you know, guys in the middle of the night with hoods on running around blocking motorways, right? Because it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. We're going to go into central London with 10,000, 20,000 people. And it's that number which is so important. And that's the biggest challenge for this movement, is to bring people onto the street to do low-level civil disobedience. Okay. So I'm going to go quickly, reasonably quickly. When do we need to finish, by the way? It's 5 to 1. Are we going till 2 or something?
1:30, I think. Or 25 to 2, I think was on the...
That's a bit rubbish, isn't it?
We're running half an hour later. No, for half an hour later, 12:35.
Okay, so no one knows. Let's just
Just make it as it goes.
yeah, I think we're going for an hour at least. This is important. Okay. Yeah, if it's any less than an hour, it's just going to be rubbish.
Because we have a break.
All right. Yeah, okay. Well, let's see, we're going to have a breakout groups in it once we've done the first section and then another one. So it'll just be me talking. Okay, so, I'm going to give you three logics. Most people sort of focus on the two, and the third one's a little bit controversial. Okay, so the first logic, by logic I mean a reason for doing it, why it works, right? So the first reason for doing civil disobedience non-violence is because it's disruptive, okay? So there's an irreducible disruptive element, but disruption, of course, people sometimes confuse disruption with violence, which is not the same. All violence is disruptive, not all disruption is violent, right? So, for instance, if you go and block a road, it's disruptive, people can't get to work. Okay, so the logic of change here is that people focus on the issue because they're upset. Do you see what I mean? And the other logic is the press become interested because you've blocked the road. So there's two sort of elements there. So if you want to be really reductive, you say non-violence is disruptive, people therefore think about the issue and then they start to change. Do you see what I mean? So it's good, it's got a lot going for it, but it's not the whole story. Okay. So this is the biggest sort of, you know, step one that everyone's gone through in this room, I'm sure, of going, oh, you know, I want them to be sensible on climate change, but they're not doing anything, but they're not doing anything. Right, I'm going to be disruptive. Do you see what I mean? So it's that like little flip, isn't it? I'm not going to just write to my MP anymore. I'm going to blockade the entrance. And the big division, of course, is when you think it's so important that it needs to happen. Do you see what I mean? So that's the sort of, that's the leap, if you see what I mean, where I am prepared to disrupt things in order to make clear this really important issue. Yeah? So when people say, well, you're being disruptive, you know, that's really bad, then you say, yes, but we would all be disruptive if something was so important. Do you see what I mean? So it is important, and therefore it justifies being disruptive, and disruption works because it makes people think about it. Okay, so the second logic, which is a little bit more sophisticated and causes a lot of confusion, is what I call the sacrifice logic. So sacrifice, obviously, is a bit of a controversial word, so you might want to use another word, but it goes basically like this, is when you get arrested, you show to your audience that you are prepared to suffer, in inverted commas, for your beliefs, okay? So that suffering, of course, is a bit of a social construction. We'll come on to that a little bit later, but basically, if you imagine someone on the 6 o'clock news, there you are, getting dragged off the road, and they go, I don't agree with that person, but I respect them for suffering for their cause, right? They'll probably put it in a different sort of way. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to agree with you, but you've basically neutralized their opposition. Do you see what I mean? So that's one dynamic. While there might be you're a mate of a mate or something, and there you are, you're getting dragged off in the road on the 6 o'clock news, and they watch it and they go, I'm sympathetic to climate change already, and God, my friend of a friend has just got dragged off a road. I feel like I have to go and support them because they're suffering on my behalf. Do you see what I mean? So the second dynamic in the literature is more powerful, arguably, than the first. There's more controversy. But there's irrefutable evidence that this is the most significant dynamic in non-violent uprisings, is if members of your cultural group see you as a member of your cultural group suffering, then they feel compelled to go and help, right? So we're all probably familiar with that, do you know what I mean? If someone falls over in the street, if it's your mum or something, you're straight there, aren't you? It's an emotional sort of thing. So how that gets elaborated, of course, and is in this thing called the backfiring effect, which is why the elites are so terrified of non-violence often, is because they're in this dilemma, okay? And the dilemma is, if they let the non-violence continue, then obviously they're losing their power and their face, and you're disrupting the economy, so that's a really big loss. Or they can opt to arrest you, stroke repress you, stroke use violence, right? Now, a lot of people that are opposed to non-violence will use this argument that, yeah, that's great, but you might get arrested, which is really bad, right? You've probably heard that argument. So the big thing to have to communicate is, obviously, like, people have to choose whether they want to get arrested, but if they choose to get arrested, then it's not bad that they get arrested. Do you see what I mean? Because the going through suffering, in inverted commas, is the process through which you get more people to come onto the street and join your cause, okay? So that's the key thing that you have to sort of explain. Do you see what I mean? So there's a book, if you want to check it out. It's by this Christian minister called Conquest Through Suffering. So you can say that's like a good old Christian sort of 1960s title. I don't think you can get away with it nowadays. But that's basically what the guy's saying. Do you see what I mean? So in most of the literature, like if you look at this guy called Gene Sharp, you'll see he basically develops these two arguments. And he's the godfather of non-violence theory, who was around in the 60s. Gene, G-E-N-E, Sharp with an E. He's got a little book on, he's got a few little books, and if you want to really impress your friends, when I used to work with Martin 30 years ago, yeah, I think one of your mates, he used to bring to peace movement meetings, used to bring the 3 volumes of Gene Sharp, right? And I was so impressed because he obviously knew his stuff, you know what I mean? And it's like one of those books which you show to your friends but you never read. No. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so some of my research and more sort of modern research arguably brings in what I rather controversially call the love dynamic, right? Don't really like the word love, but I sort of put it in my PhD because I'm not really that sort of person. But anyway, so this basically means that it's not all material, okay? So a lot of Gene Sharp tradition non-violence is, you know, you block the road, you get hit on the head by the police, you know, the church decides to support you, and then the government starts to collapse. Do you see what I mean? So it's very mechanical, behavioralistic, and, you know, it's got a lot going for it. But what I found in the many times that I've been arrested over the last 4 years is that the dynamics are a lot more like psychological than that. Do you see what I mean? So for instance, like in King's College, like we spray chalked the central hall and caused £10,000 worth of damage. So as you would expect, within 5 minutes, the vice principal was down there telling us we were shutting down the conversation, even though he'd never had a conversation with me before. And he said, like, you know, this is terrible stuff. But we were super respectful towards him. We didn't guilt trip him. We didn't do some big ideological rant. And within a week, we were having coffee with him. And within 4 weeks, we'd changed their whole strategy, their whole policy on fossil fuels, right? So this is a big elite institution. They'd already done their 10-year plan to make the world a better place, you know, how these people do things. And it was completely changed. So my analysis on that, when I went into that research was, well, we've blocked, you know, we've spray chalked the wall, disruption, you know, we're willing to go to prison and arrested, sacrifice, and now, you know, like a little domino effect, the bad guys go, yes. But when I got into the room with the vice principal, it sort of dawned on me, the main reason he was talking to me was because I was a nice guy. Do you see what I mean? So I didn't go into the room saying, you fucker, you know, you better sort things out, otherwise we're going to take down the whole King's College next week. Do you see what I mean? I was going, I'm sure you don't agree with me about this, but this is our situation, and this is what we want. We respect you have a different opinion. If we can talk about this, would be great. Do you see what I mean? And so basically I did like a therapy routine on him, and that wasn't just because I was being manipulative, or rather, I wasn't being manipulative, Freudian slip, but it was because I genuinely liked the guy. Do you see what I mean? Because I understood that he was in a particular culture, in a particular place, as a representative of something that was really bad, but he wasn't a bad person. Do you see what I mean? So this is like a critical mechanism in the non-violent sort of orientation, is to respect the opposition, partially ethically, because who are you to say you're better than them? You know, everyone in this room is part of this oppressive system, but also tactically because all the literature shows if you're nice to people, they agree with you more. Yeah.
Is that why there's the no blaming, no shaming in the 10 principles?
Yeah, so one of the things you can sort of play around with here is the moral argument versus the design argument. So a lot of people will say to me, oh, Roger, you're just being manipulative, you know what I mean? But I'm just like telling you the routine, right? But I also believe it, and if you believe it, then obviously you're more effective. But then if you're more effective, you're more manipulative. So you can sort of play that little game in your head. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so, but you know, the bottom line is, as the Buddhists say, if you think the right thing, you'll start being the right thing, if you see what I mean. So you can have a little argument about that one. But it's just going to finish off, yeah, saying, so there's a whole load of literature in psychology that shows that this tough love approach is called different things in different sectors. So for instance, like how to deal with disruptive children, how to deal with confrontation in your relationships, how to deal with negotiation. They are all sort of coming together on this tough love agenda. Do you see what I mean? So that's basically saying what you think, but being respectful. So for instance, like there's been a meta-study at Harvard on negotiation. So as you probably imagine, there's loads of research on negotiation where you go in and you go, you know, bad guy, good guy, you know, wear a big suit, you know, all these different techniques. And then they did this big study, and it's really hilarious, I think, anyway. So after like 30 years of research, they find the most effective way to get what you want from a negotiation is if the other side personally likes you or not, as a person, right? So it's like, whoosh, you know, all that macho stuff goes out the window. So it's basically, you know, whether you have a cup of coffee and you talk about your kids and why you're up all night because they're always, you know, whatever it is. Okay, so the micro design of civil disobedience is really important. And this, I'll talk more about the police in a minute, but my hypothesis personally is this is why I've been successful with the police in XR for similar reasons. Okay, so I'm just going to, sorry, that went on a bit. What time are we? Okay, so Rowan, do you want to tell me why I'm wrong? and then we'll split up into little groups to have a little chat about it.
Non-violent direct action in its entirety, right from the get-go, when you start to plan it with your mates, right through to the very end when you come out of prison, well, even after prison, if that's where you end up, and it may not be, the whole thing is a dialogue. Yeah, so the whole thing is a dialogue. So including the planning stage, during that stage, you're having a dialogue with each other about what you're doing. You're trying to work through your fear. You're trying to work through how you're going to plan this action, and that's part of the dialogue. Then you get arrested. There's more dialogue that happens in the police station. It happens between the action and the press and what gets said about it, what your mum says, what your gran says, and then that continues through the court and any press that get involved with the court case and so on. So there's, the whole thing takes place as a dialogue, and all the time you're inviting judgment. You're inviting people to say what they want to say or think what they want to think about what you've done. So that's a really important part of non-violent direct action, to see it as a dialogue. Another thing that I wanted to make a point about is the difference between being non-violent and just not being violent. Okay, so this is a subtle thing. If, say you imagine yourself at the bus stop, and usually at the bus stop nobody's talking, right? So that's nobody talking. If you go on a Buddhist retreat, people are in silence. It's a different thing, right? Do you get that? It's a different quality. Or if you imagine that you're in the theatre waiting for a performance, there's a lot of hubbub and discussion before, and then there's a moment when everything falls silent. So that again is a different quality of silence. And the quality of silence that you could describe that as is that there's an intention to it. So you start to get a sense of intention because everybody's waiting for the production to start. And it's the same with non-violence. There's a quality to the people who are sitting on the bridge or whatever it is that they're doing. The sense of intention is palpable. So people pick up on it. They see that it's not just people not being violent. There's a positive thing that's happening there. So non-violence, take the hyphen out. It's not a negative, it's a positive. And if it's effective, it will have an element of confrontation in it. Now, we tend to associate confrontation with violence, but it doesn't need to be violent. It's creating a tension, and that tension enables the dialogue to take place that will affect change. So, just trying to think. Yeah, so another example of that tension that we're trying to create is if you imagine a musical instrument, if the strings of that instrument are too slack, you won't get a note out of it. If they're too tight, it's unbearable. You can't hear it. It sounds tinny. So to make the music, that tension has to be absolutely right. And it's the same with non-violent direct action. You need to get the tension of the confrontation absolutely right. So sometimes this is quite difficult to do because if you're sitting on a bridge, for example, and it's a massive demonstration, you may not be able to see or experience exactly where the tension is. But somewhere there'll be a line of cops and a line of us, and you'll be able to pick up a sense of tension and confrontation in that area. It doesn't need to be violent, but there needs to be that tension there in order to affect change. The other place where there's a tension is in the press, so what the press say about it. So there's a dialogue starting to happen in the press, and that also encourages that, that confrontation is there, and the confrontation feeds into the dialogue, and the dialogue feeds into the confrontation, if you see what I mean. Yeah, Roger talked about how with non-violence, lots of people will do it. So I've been involved in non-violent direct action for about 30 years, and I've done a lot of actions, most of which have been highly successful. And at a certain point, I started to think, hang on a minute, this is really successful, what we're doing here, but nobody else is doing it. And that's the problem with non-violent direct action. People won't do it. And so this is why, you know, what we're doing here today, what I hope you ask yourself the question, are you going to do it? Because I don't think, you know, there's nobody else here that's going to do it other than you. And so I think we all need to be asking the question, are we going to be one of those people who are going to take the risk? Which brings me to fear. Am I out of time?
Yeah, no, good.
No? So a lot of people think, well, you know, you have to be really courageous and, you know, be quite feisty to risk arrest and, you know, maybe risk prison or something like that, or be fined. So how do you get over that? I'm a very anxious person. I experience a lot of fear. And what I've learnt over the years is that you can get over that. So I'm not especially courageous. But if I get together with a group of people and we share what we're feeling and we start to build up trust, my sense of courage grows as that group starts to bond, as those feelings of trust start to develop. So a lot of it is about preparing, so giving yourself a period of time to get used to what you're planning to do. If you have that time to prepare, you just need the time to kind of step up to your own intention, as it were. Also, if you have the support, if you have people around you who maybe aren't risking what you're doing, but are saying, yes, we're with you, we're rooting for you, it makes it more possible for you to take that risk. The other thing is that there are some tools for dealing with strong emotion like fear. So if you're experiencing fear and you try to push it away, that fear will get bigger. If you feel it in your body and you breathe into it, it starts to dissipate. that's something that you have to practice. If you just do it in the heat of the situation, it probably won't work. But what you can do as a group is practice breathing into the fear, feeling it in the body, and noticing how it starts to get smaller. And the more you do it, the more effective it becomes. The fourth thing about fear is that you can feel the fear and just do it anyway. So you can go with your knees knocking, you can go trembling and feeling dreadful, but you're still up for it. And actually, when you get out to the other side, it's tremendously empowering. And you can feed off your own sense of inspiration about what you're doing. So my experiences of being all but probably the first 2 experiences of being arrested were a bit scary. But after that, I would feel a tremendous sense of the rightness of what I'd done, and I could feed on that, and I'd sit in a police cell and think, yes, I'm really glad I'm here. I don't care if it's for 10 hours or however long it is. I can feed off my own good intentions and the rightness of my action, and that will sustain me to do it again. So you start to see that actually it's not that bad. So, yeah. Will that do?
Yeah,
is that enough?
Thanks so
yeah,
much.
Good.
Okay. Yeah, just to follow on that, I mean, just to give a little personal thing as well, is that I did loads of getting arrested in my early 20s and then had a break for 20 years. And then I've been arrested like 10 times in the last year. And the first 2 or 3 times, I'm actually a really nice sort of person. I hate upsetting people. And the first time I did it, I was shaking and hated every minute of it. And now I just go, I'm just thinking about what book I'm going to read in the cell and what a nice rest it's going to be. And what I've got to do tomorrow morning. So, exposure reduces fear. But the idea that people that do a lot of civil disobedience are some heroes is just total rubbish. With just, people to do a lot of it are just normal, often very fearful people themselves. So, I just want to have breakout groups now. So in 4 or 5s, what you can do is just discuss what we've both said. There's no particular agenda on it, but maybe if there's things that you're a little bit unclear about in what we've said, you can ask the other people for clarification. Because I think there's some people here that are, some people know loads, and other people maybe not. So feel free to exchange some bits of wisdom about it, and then we'll come back and we'll look at a few more bits of the argumentation around why it works and why it doesn't. Okay? So groups of 4 and 5. Okay. So I've got half an eye on some of you guys like doing workshops on this for other people, right? Because since the things have happened in November, like Extinction Rebellion is a very new movement. Like 80% of the people haven't even heard of non-violence before, do you know what I mean? So there's quite a big educational challenge we have here to sort of get over what I've just, me and Rowan have just communicated. So what I'd suggest is, the main thing about doing workshops is just to do them, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. So I would suggest if you're in groups or you want to do something in your locality, you have a workshop on civil disobedience. And what you do is you just go through those 3 elements. Do you see what I mean? And that's sufficient to get most people on board with the basics, right? So for instance, like when we did Stop Killing Londoners pollution campaign, we'd have a roadblock and we put it on Facebook and lots of people would come and half of them had never blocked a road before. And we did literally a 15-minute workshop on non-violence, right? But that's worth like 80% of what you need to tell people about non-violence. Do you see what I mean? It's open, we're being nice to the police, we're being, respectful to the general public, we're not closed, we're not going to cover our faces, we're going to work as a group. If you don't like that, that's cool, and some people left because they weren't into that. Do you see what I mean? So I don't think you need to worry that you're not a bloody non-violence scholar, right? It's not that necessary. The main thing is to get across the fundamentals to as many people as possible before April, okay? So I'm going to deal a little bit controversially maybe, but I think is, you know, it's quite easy to do workshops and just focus on all the stuff that everyone agrees, but there are some like significant issues around what XR is doing and criticisms, which I'm going to attempt to deal with, right? So I want to have a disclaimer that some of these things I'm going to say are not, it's not official XR policy, do you see what I mean? But I think it's more honest to deal with some of these criticisms head on rather than just be silent about them, okay? So if you don't necessarily totally agree with me, that's cool, and I'm not saying I've put it in quite the right way, so don't give me a hard time too much. Okay, so the first thing, which we've sort of already mentioned, is if you're asking people to get arrested, isn't it bad that people are getting arrested, right? So just to reiterate, the reply to that is, one, people choose to get arrested, so there's no pressure, right? So this is a fundamental thing to get across to people and people that are criticizing XR, is no one's saying judgmentally that you have to get arrested. But that doesn't mean that empirically getting arrested works. But they're two separate points, and people get confused between the two. So you want to make those separate. Do you see what I mean? If you want to not get arrested, that's totally cool. If you want to do support roles, that's brilliant. And if you get arrested, that's brilliant. And the literature shows that direct action works for the reasons we've discussed. Do you see what I mean? Okay, so the basic principle in XR is everyone's totally respected whatever choice they make. All right? So I would suggest that that's the orientation. So the second problem is people will say, it's bad getting arrested, you know? Like, getting arrested, in other words, is a defeat, right? And that comes from the sort of direct action movement sort of orientation, which is the idea is to go out in the street, make a protest, and you're trying not to get arrested, you know what I mean? Which is fair enough. You see, there's a logic to that. I have a right to protest. The police arrested me. That was bad. Do you see what I mean? So that's the logic. It's a certain logic, and it's got a lot going for it. But that is not the logic of civil disobedience, okay? The logic of civil disobedience is the dilemma logic, which is you've already won, right? You go into the space of conflict, and whatever they do, you've won. Because if they allow you to do it, you've won because you get the publicity, and you've gone into that space. And if they arrest you, you've won because you've shown the public you're willing to sacrifice, and you've got the publicity from that. Do you see what I mean? So it's a different logic. It's not like saying one's right or wrong. It's just like explaining what you're trying to do. Do you see what I mean? Okay, so the danger of getting this right, I want to talk about the police and the XR policy on the police and what we've done, okay? So again, like, there's a particular logic to it, and the logic is not airtight, but there's a logic, all right? So the first thing to say is there's a lot of confusion, again, around the morality of the police and tactical and strategic decisions on what to do, right? So these are two separate things. So people think that if you're going to talk to the police, you are necessarily saying the police are good, right? But that's simply not necessarily the case. It's possible to go and see the police and think the police are good guys, right? But it's also possible to go and see the police and believe they're bad guys, right? Okay, so the first step is to separate the morality issue from the tactical issue. So the morality issue is the police are structurally racist, they've been involved in unjust actions against minority groups, some of which have been horrendous, and that continues to happen, right? That's a given. So it's really clear that that's the case and that's bad and we disagree with it. Okay. However, and at the same time, many civil disobedience groups maintain non-violent discipline and get involved with talking to the police for tactical reasons, which I'll come into in a minute. Often, and very often, when the police are far, far worse in their unjust actions than in this country. In other words, where you're going to get caught, you're going to get tortured and killed. Okay, so why do those movements engage with the security forces? Let's give it a wide definition. There are three main reasons, as I see it, for talking with the police, okay, which obviously covers a multitude of sins. Number one is if you talk to the police, there is a higher probability that they'll treat you legally and civilly when you go and do the action, okay? And the reason for this is because they know what's going to happen, okay? So you don't go to the police and say, we're thinking about blocking a bridge. Is that okay, right? That's what a lot of people think happens. We've never gone to the police and said, is it okay? We say, go to the police and say, we are going to block the bridge. Do you see what I mean? And it will be X and Y. We will be there for this amount of hours, and we'll be peaceful and non-violent and civil, right? So that makes it more likely that the police, I mean, it doesn't guarantee it, but it makes it more likely that the police will go, okay, it's not going to be a riot, so we don't have to go in aggressively, which is the rationale for going up to the police in actions and saying two things. This is a non-violent and peaceful action, and we respect you have to do your job. It always goes down very well, okay? Respecting people have to do the job doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it. You're just respecting that they have to do it, if you see what I mean. Okay, so that's the first reason. The second reason is to enable the action to go ahead to the point that you get to a critical mass, okay? So with the BBC action, I talked to this guy, Wayne, who's the police liaison officer, and I said, we're going to go to the BBC, and this is what's going to happen. We're going to do X, Y, and Z, but we're not going to do A, B, and C, right? And he said to me, now we know what's going to happen, we think we can cope with that, so we're not going to put a section 14 on it, right? Section 14, it might be section something else, but it's something like that. So that basically means that the police will say ahead of time that anyone who enters that space will be liable to be arrested straight away. Do you see what I mean? So we could participate in low-level mass civil disobedience at the BBC because we'd told the police exactly what's happening, and they did a risk analysis that it didn't require a section 14. Do you see what I mean? So this doesn't guarantee that they won't do a section 14, but it makes it less likely. So that enables us to achieve our tactical objective, which is to get to the BBC, get on telly, get some people arrested for peaceful civil disobedience. Okay, so I'll say a little bit more about the critical mass thing in a minute. And the third reason, which sounds a little like dramatic because we're all in this sort of gradualist sort of tradition in Britain, but if you look at the literature sort of globally on why people are nice in inverted commas to the security forces, it's because the critical moment in creating political change in most societies over the last 100 years is when a critical mass of the security forces either defect or become demoralized and don't carry out their orders. Okay, so what that means is the state is only the state to the extent that it can monopolize violence and operationalize violence. Do you see what I mean? So the moment at which the security forces decide to do that to varying degrees, the state and the elite that dominates the state will lose its power. Okay? So once you look at the literature, you usually find you have this big build-up and the people will go directly to the soldiers or directly to the police with the explicit tactical aim to demoralize and persuade. Do you see what I mean? So that's why they put the flowers in the rifles, right? Not because they're hippies. We're having this chat, weren't we? Not because they're hippies, or they might be hippies, but because they've made an accurate assessment that tactically that will maximise the chances of not getting shot. Do you see what I mean? Because they don't want the repression to happen, apart from, yeah? So in this particular context, obviously, like we might make an assessment that Metropolitan Police are not on the verge of defection, but never say never. But it is quite likely that they will become demoralised, okay, stroke neutralised. So if you don't believe that, you can have a look at what happened in France, where they had 5 days of disruption, and the police unions went to the state and said, we are considering doing a go slow because we haven't been paid and we're fucked off, that we're just having this this situation. Do you see what I mean? So it does work. And if you look at the literature, it's between 5 and 10 days. Okay? Something like that. That's how long it sort of takes. Right.
Just add to that, in my experience, it might not sound that big really, but many policemen that have arrested me have apologised profusely, have felt embarrassed about having to do it. And I've also had a situation where I was due to go to prison for 2 weeks for non-payment of fine. I wrote to the court to say why I was taking this principal position of not paying, and the judge gave me half an hour at the back of the court, and that was my 2 weeks in prison. So you also get situations where files disappear, so you've been arrested, you've been charged, and suddenly there's no record of you ever having been arrested. So that used to happen back in the police days. Police movement days. I haven't heard of it happening lately, but it could happen again. So.
Okay, so I just said a more controversial thing, which is about white people doing civil disobedience and how that relates to oppressed groups or minority groups or people of colour. Okay, so probably destroy my reputation here. But I want to just like map out 2 logics which can be put forward. And my proposition is both of them are sort of true, but not absolutely true. So the first logic is Extinction Rebellion is excluding people of colour and oppressed groups because it's asking people to be arrested. And if you're arrested as a black person or a person of colour, you're more likely to end up being discriminated against or be subject to special treatment by the police, right? Okay? So you've probably heard that criticism. There's also another logic which is sort of paradoxically like has other implications. So the other logic is that white people have a certain amount of privilege and they should be engaging in civil disobedience so that they can use their privilege in order to make a difference. And to make that difference effectively, you engage in civil disobedience, because most black people or people of colour are not going to get involved in civil disobedience because they've got too much on their plate and they've got other more immediate issues to be involved in, right? So, for instance, I've got a guy that I had an hour-and-a-half conversation with who's a London black guy who's worked in Brixton for 30 years, and he said the second logic, okay, which is Extinction Rebellion should be going ahead because the white people should be doing this and black people aren't primarily going to get involved, right? So the problem here is not with the logics, in my humble opinion, it's with the extremity of pushing the logic, if you see what I mean. So both logics are true, but they're not absolutely true. Do you see what I mean? And one of the problems here is assigning characteristics to a group of people that necessarily means all the people in that group are like that, okay? So a way that you might want to have a nuanced response to this is, yes, a lot of people in XR are white and they're going to use their privilege, as it were, in order to challenge the state. And that's certainly the opinion of a lot of people in the global south. I worked with civil rights movements in India when I was younger, and that was their attitude. They didn't want white people going to the global south. They wanted white people to stay in the global north and to bring down the governments who were responsible for their oppression. Do you see what I mean? So that means that we should be in this country and we should be doing what XR is doing. Okay, so that's one orientation. Another orientation is to go into the spaces where oppressed people are or people of colour and present the possibility that they may wish to get involved in civil disobedience on the climate issue, right? And then allowing a sense of humility to decide which individuals or any of those individuals may wish to undertake that action, because it's obviously an individual decision at the end of the day. So it might mean that more people of colour do get involved, but not lots of them, because they've got other things to think about, like knife crime, for instance. Do you see what I mean? So how I would respond to that, and obviously you can choose how to do it, and I don't know whether XR is going to have official policy on it, but it's good to map out those two logics because they contradict each other, if you see what I mean. So to a certain extent, we need to decide which one's right, or rather have some nuance on it. The final point on this is that the strategy that we are pursuing here has mainly been perfected by people of colour in the global south. We are following what is called the civil resistance model. So if you look at Philippines in 1984, or Burma, or some South American examples, this is basically the model. People go to the capital city and they sit down until the government falls, okay? So that we are primarily learning from the movements of people of colour in the global south, and of course Martin Luther King and Gandhi. Okay, so that's one sort of argument that is prevalent, and obviously decide how you want to take that one. I'm just going to reasonably quickly just mention one or two more sort of problems, as you might say. So there's the problem between material actions and symbolic actions. So traditionally in the direct action movement in the UK, as I've already said, there's a debate or a tendency to overemphasize the material, okay? So we're going up to the fracking site, we're going to block the entrance, the lorries can't get in, and therefore they'll have extra costs and they won't be able to continue, right? So that's a certain logic, but it needs to be modified in response to the other logic, which is it's about hearts and minds, if you see what I mean. So the symbolic argument is you do something that is dramatic and it prefigures the future, let's say, or it's more emotional and it gets people to talk, yeah? So it's not like one's right or wrong, right? But arguably in the past there's been a tendency to overemphasize the material, which tends to go more into a more extreme sort of macho logic. Do you know what I mean? The bad guys need to be taken down, we're going to blockade the base, right? But what we need is more nuance and saying, yes, that's fine, and we need to create this sort of sacrifice element as well. So I'm sure some people will criticize us for blocking the centre of London because they'll say we need to go to the oil depots and block those, right? So it's not like that's a bad idea necessarily, but on balance, what we're going for is changing the hearts and minds of people in the country, okay? But, you know, it's like that. Okay, yeah. Yeah, there's a little bit of confusion because what's happening in London is a bit of a hybrid, right? So the name of the game is often to have hybridity in these things, right? Do you see what I mean? The most important thing in design is balance, right? You take two opposing elements and you don't go just that or just that. Well, that's good for rhetoric, but it's not good for design. Design is about nuance. It's about saying we're taking a bit of that and a bit of that and we're going to optimize it. So yeah, we are going to be blocking the streets in London, so we are going to have the materiality, but we're going to have people going to prison or getting arrested, which is the hearts and minds logic. Do you see what I mean? So if any of you join the group to do the micro design for the April the 15th, we will be continually micro designing it, and we won't decide exactly on the balances until very near to the actual point. Do you see what I mean? Of how we're going to do it. Because it needs to be sufficiently disruptive, but not overly disruptive. Do you see what I mean? Okay, so I'm just going to do two other design things for you to think about. And I'll do these quite quickly because I've already mentioned them. but one of them is about getting to do your actions without getting them repressed too quickly. So I've already mentioned to you the design challenge of the BBC action, right? So we were umming and ahhing about how full on it was going to be, if you see what I mean. But one of the things that you want to consider is staging in a strategic design. So you don't want to have repression happen too early, but from a design point of view, you do want it coming in at some stage so you can bring in the sacrifice element. So one of the reasons, and you might say, well, you don't want to tell the police this, but we can discuss that later. But one of the reasons to sort of bring the police along with us in terms of April the 15th is to be able to do something for 3 days without getting completely arrested to death, as you might say. Do you see what I mean? Because if it happens on day 1, then the whole thing doesn't get to a critical mass of publicity, right? But if it's still going after 7 days, then, and you haven't been arrested, then that's a problem because you want to bring the arrests in from a design point of view. So I'll quickly give you a really famous example from the literature on this, which is a bit dramatic, but you can sort of see how it works. Is in Leipzig in 1989, this minister brought out his flock into the centre of Leipzig. And I don't know the exact numbers, so you can check out the paper. But it went something like this. Is obviously East Germany, police state, people shot each other, blah, blah. Big deal situation. So he brought the 80 people out, and it was not enough of a big deal for the police chief to do anything about it. In other words, it was underneath that point of criticality, right? So the police chief didn't do anything about it because he just couldn't be bothered. And after all, they're Christians and they don't do anything, right? So he was drawn into it. So the following week, there was 2,000 people, right? Because those 80 people have encouraged the next 2,000 people to come out. Do you see what I mean? So they were obviously very brave. And he was going, oh no, we've got a problem here. But because it's a hierarchical system, he had to check with Berlin what to do about it. Do you see what I mean? So he got on the phone, sent a message to Berlin, to the top of the hierarchy, and because they had to check with people who had to check with people that had to check with the dictator or whatever, he didn't get a reply back by the following week. And the following week was something like 5,000 people, right? Then he got the message back that he should go out and shoot people, okay? Because they have to get it in the bud. So the following week he went out with his soldiers to shoot the people in Leipzig, but it was 20,000 people. And he couldn't bring himself to shoot that many people because he was too scared. Do you see what I mean? Do you see what I mean? So he lost the moment, right? So he refused to do it. And the following week was 50,000 people because everyone was going, oh, right, it's okay, let's go. Do you see what I mean? And the following week, the regime collapsed, okay? So the lesson of this is that if you can create enough space to get to that point in London, then you might get to the point where lots of people start wanting to join because it's sexy and it's Glastonbury and do you see what I mean? It doesn't really matter what the rationale is. So that's something to sort of think about. Do you see what I mean? It's all about when and how and if. So the last little design challenge is movement building and the actual thing. So I think I've mentioned this, but so I'll just reiterate it. Is there's 2 reasons for doing civil disobedience, and obviously there can be a mix, but you need to decide what you're trying to do primarily. So you want to decide, are you going to do movement building, or are you going to do what you need to do to change the situation? Do you see what I mean? So as you're probably aware now, the idea of doing the actions up to April the 15th is primarily movement building. We don't want to be going in there, burning people out, blah, blah, doing some full-on shaboodle. What we want to do is dress rehearsals. People do it, they think that's not so bad, and then they'll come on April the 15th. Do you see what I mean? But on April the 15th, we're not doing movement building, right? We're doing the thing. So April the 15th is the real thing. Okay. All right. So have another 5-minute chat between yourselves and maybe speak about in your local groups or from the movement building point of view, some thoughts about how to design that given the principles I've told you. And I'll just do a final rhetorical spiel at the end and then we'll go and get lunch. Okay, so the last point I wanted to make was similar to what I made yesterday, is that if you are doing this workshop about civil disobedience or non-violence, the thing to finish up on, which is a bit like contradicts everything else, is that if you're going into the space in a way in which you expect a result, a particular result, then empirically speaking, you are more likely to get burnt out than going into that space with a service orientation. Okay? So there's a guy from Oxfam who did similar research to me, and he found that the guys in the global south that are on the front line, you know, getting shot, arrested, all this awful stuff that happens, are not primarily interested in winning, right? They're primarily interested in being the person they believe they are to be, okay? So there's a whole plurality of rationales within that statement. So for instance, a nun may be going, you know, down to demonstrate day after day. How did they get the courage to do that? They get the courage to do it because they believe it's the right thing to do because God said so. Do you see what I mean? So, but obviously if that's not your particular orientation, you could have a existentialist orientation like me, which is more like, I only live once and I want to do something interesting and I'm going to go down and do this. Do you see what I mean? So there's a whole range of them. But the point is to say to people is you need to consciously decide that you're doing it not because of the result, but because of some rationale other than the result, if you see what I mean. And that's like a service orientation or a sacrificial orientation. And what the guy from Oxfam said is the people on the front line have this, what me and him would call a virtue ethics orientation, which is I'm doing it because of honor and justice and, you know, tradition or whatever you want. While the people in the global north, in the Oxfam office, they tend to be instrumentalist and utilitarian because that's our culture. Don't do it unless it makes sense. Do you see what I mean? So that's quite an interesting sociological result, of course. But what you want to communicate to people is, as I said, is you don't necessarily have to completely convince yourself, but it's good. We did this with Stop Killing Londoners when people are going to go to prison. We got people to write down why they are going to go on April the 15th. Do you see what I mean? And say to people, why are you going other than you're wanting to win? Do you see what I mean? And then people can practice that meditative state. Do you see what I mean? Over and over again. This is what Gandhi called self-purification, which is you're not doing it because it's an ego thing, right? So that's always a good thing to finish on after you've just said all the reasons how to be successful. But I haven't got a solution to that contradiction. Yeah, so if any of you want to come and speak to me and tell me why it was all wrong, or Rowan, no, very bad, or Rowan, then obviously feel free. And I'll see you on the 15th.